Shadows over Kansas City Part 2, Sanctuary in the Storm. The dim light of the January evening filtered through the curtains as Garwood stirred in his bed, the warmth of the blanket shielding him from the cold air of the house. A soft, persistent pressure on his chest roused him fully, and as his eyes blinked open, he found himself staring into the wide, curious eyes of his 4-year-old daughter, Katie. Her small hand stroked his face gently, her dark curls tumbling around her round cheeks. "Papa," she said with a smile, her voice sweet and light, "Mama says it's time for you to get up." Garwood chuckled, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as Katie nestled against him, her head resting in the crook of his arm. He pulled her close, feeling the warmth of her small frame against his chest. "Do you have to go to work?" Katie asked, her voice tinged with childish curiosity. "Why can't you catch bad men when the sun is up? Why does it have to be night?" Garwood smiled, smoothing her curls with a calloused hand. "Well, some bad men are like owls. They only come out at night. So if I want to catch them, I have to go out at night too." Katie giggled, kicking her legs before standing on the bed and looking down at him with mischievous eyes. "Do they eat mice like owls?" Garwood laughed, the sound deep and genuine. "No, sweetheart, they don't eat mice." Her laughter filled the room as she began to jump on the bed, chanting, "Papa, get up! Papa, get up!" With a resigned sigh and a grin on his face, Garwood rose, watching as Katie scampered out of the room. Her excited voice echoed down the hall. "Mama, Papa is up!" In the kitchen, the warm scent of cooking greeted Garwood as he entered. Marie stood at the stove, her dark curls pinned loosely, her amber eyes focused on the meal she was preparing. Katie had turned the space beneath the table into a fortress of dolls and toys, her imaginary world sprawling across the floor. Seated nearby was Olivia, her arms resting on her knees as she sat on the floor, her gaze distant and pained. She watched Katie play, but her expression revealed the weight she carried, the memories she couldn't shake. Garwood's presence seemed to snap her from her thoughts. She looked up, and her eyes landed on the revolver at his hip. The sight transported her back in an instant to the night. Carlucci fell. She could still see the gun in Garwood's hand, hear its thunderous roar, and smell the acrid scent of gunpowder. The street had run red that night, blood pooling around her shoes. The image of her parents' lifeless bodies flashed in her mind, and her breath hitched. Garwood moved to her side and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. The touch startled her, bringing her back to the present. She met his steady gaze before lowering her eyes, unable to speak. "They won't ever stop," Garwood said softly, his voice cutting through the silence like a balm. "The memories will always be there, but over time, they'll come less and less. And when they do, they'll still hurt, but not as much." Olivia nodded faintly, tears welling in her eyes. Garwood continued, his tone measured. "When you're ready, or if you want to, I can figure out a way to make it safe. Thaddeus wants to talk to you. Is that something you'd want me to work on?" Olivia nodded again, her tears spilling over as she thought of the boy who had suffered alongside her. Katie, noticing Olivia's tears, scrambled out from under the table and stood in front of her. Her little hand reached out to wipe Olivia's cheeks with the cuff of her sleeve. "Olivia," she mispronounced, her voice tender, "don't cry." The child's eyes darted to her parents for guidance, unsure of how to comfort Olivia. Then, as if instinctively, Katie threw her arms around Olivia's neck, squeezing her as tightly as she could. Her curls pressed into Olivia's face, tickling her nose and lips. Olivia tried to brush Katie's hair away, but the small child's enthusiasm caused them both to topple over in a heap on the floor. For the first time in what felt like weeks, Olivia laughed, a real, full laugh. Katie joined in, her giggles infectious as they untangled themselves and stood up. Garwood and Marie exchanged a glance, relief washing over them at the sound of Olivia's laughter. Though fleeting, it was a step forward. The sound of Katie's laughter faded as she and Olivia worked to clear the toys from beneath the table. Olivia carefully placed each doll into a small basket, her movements precise and deliberate, as though organizing the toys could bring order to her own chaotic thoughts. She glanced up at Marie, who was at the stove, humming softly as she stirred a pot. The warmth of the home was almost overwhelming, so different from the cold, brutal world she'd been thrust into just months ago. Marie glanced over her shoulder, catching Olivia's eye. Olivia hesitated, unsure how to voice the thoughts swirling in her mind. She began, her voice faltering. She picked up another doll, her fingers tracing its stitched smile. I don't know how to thank you for everything, for taking me in. Marie set the spoon down and wiped her hands on her apron before sitting across from Olivia. Her amber eyes, so much like Katie's, softened as she spoke. You don't have to thank us, Olivia. You've been through so much, and Beau. She paused, her lips twitching into a faint smile. Garwood wouldn't have it any other way. You're safe here, and that's what matters. But it's not just that, Olivia said, her voice trembling. I've brought so much trouble with me. I see what this is doing to him. He's already been through so much, and now I'm just more weight on his shoulders. Marie reached out, placing a comforting hand over Olivia's. You're not a burden, Olivia. Beau's carried a lot for a long time, but you give him purpose, and maybe you can learn to carry a little of that weight yourself one day when you're ready. Olivia nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She looked down at her lap, guilt and gratitude warring within her. I hope so. I really do. Marie kept the conversation light as Katie and Olivia cleared the toys together. The family set the table. As the family gathered around the meal, the warm glow of the lamp overhead made the small dining room feel like a sanctuary from the cold January night. Katie's small hands were clasped in prayer as she said grace in her sweet, innocent voice, her curls bouncing slightly with every word. When she finished with a hearty amen, Garwood and Marie exchanged a quick smile before reaching for the food. The conversation drifted to lighter topics as they ate, with Katie eagerly recounting her adventures with her dolls. Marie asked Olivia about the sewing projects they'd worked on together, careful to keep the conversation comforting and unhurried. As Garwood savored a rare moment of peace, he found himself thinking of Cosner's earlier confession. He glanced at Marie, the faintest smirk playing at his lips. You'll like this, he said, leaning back in his chair. Cosner's sweet on a girl. Marie looked up from her plate, her eyebrows arching in surprise. Cosner? Do tell. Garwood nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. Said her name's Roseanne Carpenter. Works at a diner not far from the apartment. Poor guy's been walking out of his way just to order coffee and stare at her like a lovesick pup. Marie laughed softly, shaking her head. I never thought I'd see the day. It seems like he can barely speak to women. That's what makes it funny, Garwood said with a chuckle. You should have seen him when he told me. Got all sheepish, like a kid caught stealing candy. What did you tell him? Marie asked, her amber eyes sparkling with amusement. I told him to just talk to her. He's good at running his mouth when he's got something to say. Figured he might as well use that skill for something other than shouting at criminals. Marie smiled, leaning forward slightly. And what did he say to that? Garwood shrugged, his grin widening. He just tipped his cap and walked off. But knowing him, he'll probably sit at that diner every night for a week before he works up the nerve. Marie laughed again, the sound light and musical. Well, I hope it works out for him. He deserves a little happiness. Garwood nodded, his expression softening. He does. Lord knows we could all use some. The conversation shifted, and as Katie began chattering about her dolls again, Garwood caught Olivia watching quietly from her seat. Though her gaze was distant, there was the faintest hint of a smile on her lips, as though the warmth of the moment had managed to reach her despite the shadows in her mind. As they cleared the table together after dinner, Garwood couldn't help but feel a small flicker of hope. Even amidst the chaos and danger of their lives, moments like these reminded him why he kept fighting. After the meal, Garwood and Marie washed the dishes while Olivia sat on the couch with Katie, reading her a story. The sight of the two brought a rare warmth to Garwood's chest, though he knew his time with them tonight was limited. Marie handed him a towel to dry them, their hands brushing briefly. She leaned against the counter, watching him with a faint smile. What is it, Beau? She asked. Garwood sighed, setting the plate down and meeting her gaze. Just thinking, about Olivia, about all of it. Marie tilted her head, waiting for him to continue. She's carrying so much, Garwood said, his voice low. I see it every time I look at her, and I hate lying to Thaddeus about where she is, but it's the only way to keep her safe. Marie stepped closer, resting a hand on his arm. You're doing what you have to. She knows that, even if she can't say it yet. And Thaddeus, he'll understand in time. Garwood's eyes softened as he looked at her. I don't know how you do it, Marie, how you hold all this together. Marie smiled, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. Because I believe in you, Beau, and I believe in what you're doing. That makes it easier. Garwood leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I don't deserve you, he murmured. Marie laughed softly. You say that every time, and every time you're wrong. As the evening deepened and the night called, Garwood slipped on his coat and prepared to leave. Katie scrambled from Olivia's lap and ran to the door, wrapping herself around his leg. He bent down, kissing her curls. Be good, sweetheart, he murmured. Marie approached, drying her hands on a towel, and kissed Garwood softly on the lips. Her touch was warm and grounding, a moment of solace before he stepped back into the chaos of the streets. Olivia, still holding the children's book, watched the scene with quiet reverence. The contrast between the man before her and the one she had seen in battle was stark. She wondered if Katie would ever see the side of her father that lived in shadows and fought in the darkness. She silently hoped the child never would. As Garwood turned to leave, his eyes met Olivia's. The words caught in her throat, but she finally spoke. When it's safe and you think the time is right, I'd like to speak with Thaddeus. I think I owe him some answers. Garwood nodded, his expression resolute. With one last glance at his family, he stepped into the cold night, the door closing softly behind him.